So Dan, I mean, before we get into I guess the implications of the Brexit and just for folks who have not followed this, sort of the history leading up to this, it's pretty fascinating, and particularly in light of the fact that one of the main architects of the Leave the EU movement in Great Britain basically seems to have been outmaneuvered in terms of one of the main reasons why he was pursuing the leave the EU, and I'm talking about Boris Johnson's dropping out of the race to become the leader of the Conservative Party. But just tell us, sort of getting up to this point, where all the players were on this, and how we got to this point.
Well, there are lots of good reasons for critics on the left to have problems with the European Union and the currency union. Over in recent years, we have seen European leaders use their power to impose brutal austerity measures on countries in the south of Europe, notably Greece, against all economic logic, causing extraordinary human pain. More generally, the Europe's response to the economic crisis has not been to do much to alleviate it, but just to extend the pain. And because of that, we've seen, in part because of that, we've seen widespread growing alienation from the EU, anger at the EU, and in many cases that has taken its form as xenophobia and racism, because while the workings of the global economy are kind of abstract and hard for people to understand, migrants and refugees, and there's a refugee crisis in Europe, are pretty straightforward, embodied examples of how the world is changing. So I think often, instead of people blaming the corporate and financial forces that are harming them and economically, it's pretty easy to pin the blame on new arrivals who look different. And so in the UK, England in particular, and throughout Europe, we've seen the rise of a new radical nationalist populist right that is stridently anti-immigrant and anti-EU. So while there is a leftist case to make against the EU, the Brexit campaign was not fueled by leftist or progressive sentiment. It was led by a wing of the Tories, the Conservative Party, and UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which is a radical right xenophobic party. So most on the left, even those who are Eurosceptics, supported the Remain campaign, because an exit from the European Union under current political conditions and under the conditions of the campaign being led by the right and the UK government being led by the right means that we're seeing, and it's passed obviously, so we're seeing Brexit on right-wing terms, and that's something that no one in the British left would get behind.
Yeah, and let me just step in here, because it seems to me that there are two strains of criticism about the EU, right? And I think you've laid it out here. One is the shared currency, and that's problematic for people, just to be clear, because the currency is when a country does not have the control over its own currency, if they are sort of the tough end of the stick, as it were, within the context of the union, they will have terms dictated to them that will involve cutting of services and be problematic for their society. And we now know, I mean, I think we probably knew in 2008, and we should say much of what we're seeing now, it sort of feels like there was a storm in the middle of an ocean, and we're just watching it wash upon the shore now, 6, 7, 8 years later. That when you don't have control of your own currency, you don't have the ability to deficit spend in the way that you want to, and it
And in the way
forces
that
austerity.
the way that the U.S. did.
Exactly. But the thing is, in Britain, they never adopted the euro in terms of the currency. They were only part of the other aspects of the union, and the austerity was actually a function of their own domestic government, be it conservative or neoliberal, if you will, or ostensibly a labor in some instances. And none of that part would be addressed in Brexit, right? You'd still be subjected to the same sort of economic philosophies. I think Osborne the other day said, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to basically impose more austerity to get ourselves out of this hole, which it's like we're going to dig our way out of this hole by digging deeper down.
Yeah, I mean, indeed. I mean, for all of the good reasons to criticize Europe, in the UK, the UK is not part of the monetary union, as you said, and they've been plenty able to advance an austerity agenda with it through their national government, a Tory government, with the compliance and inclusion of the Liberal Democrats and portions of the Labour Party. So it's, but again, these things. Politics are the way socioeconomic difficulties translate into politics is complicated and can go a few different ways. And in this recent story that I did, I basically argued that the only solution to the sort of right wing efforts to demagogue against immigrants and migrants and refugees, to scapegoat them for people's very real socioeconomic crisis that people are living in. The left is really the socialist left is really the only force that can articulate a different story that makes sense of the conditions that people are living in. Tony Blair recently took to the New York Times in a pretty silly op-ed, complaining that the political center has lost its power to persuade, and its essential means of connection to the people it seeks to represent. And he basically draws an equivalency between the far left and the far right, and between the left's attacks on banks and the right's attack on immigrants. He is right that there is a very real anger and that it's up for grabs, but the solutions put forward by the left and the right are both morally and politically very, very different things. But what's clear, and what Tony Blair is right about, is that the neoliberal establishment center, whatever you want to call them, is in big trouble and has no solutions or means to persuade people that they have solutions to problems of their own making.
So, Daniel, when we broke, we were basically just recounting the what happens when you have a financial crisis and then you have austerity and neoliberal policies imposed upon a country, whether it's by the EU or, in the case of Great Britain, largely self-inflicted, because they had one of probably the sweetheart deal in the context of the EU, getting much of the benefit and with little of the downside. There is a tremendous amount of immigration, obviously, within the EU, because the borders are more or less thrown down. People can move in. And there was clearly an opportunity for racism and xenophobia and nativism to express itself through this Brexit. And let me just ask you, one of the things that I find a little frustrating is this notion that this racism is bred by these policies. It seems to me that it's very easy, and you see a lot more scapegoating that takes place against immigrants when there are bad times, of course. But I mean, I think it's clear that to the extent that there were those on the left who were voting for this, they were voting against the policies of the EU as opposed to voting against immigrants, right? And like, you know, we're starting to see video images coming out of Britain at times now where you're seeing these sort of like public displays of racism and nativism, which, you know, largely speaking, the British people are rejecting. But I just wonder, I mean, I raise this because you hear a lot of analysis in this country that if the Brits ultimately leave the EU, because it's not a fait accompli at this point, this is good for Donald Trump or something. And do you really think there's this one-to-one relationship between what's going on there and here?
Well, I think it's more a matter of like lessons to be drawn from one case to the other, rather than the idea that your average American voter is sitting around making up their mind about how they feel about the global economy, immigrants, globalization, and the November elections based on Brexit. I mean, despite all the attention it's taking up in the media, I think most American voters are making up their minds based upon things that are far more close and tangible to them. But I do think that there are lessons to be drawn in the sense that that in the United States, like in much of Europe, that the global economic and national economic, as you correctly emphasized earlier, models that have prevailed in recent decades have favored big finance and big business with the purported expectations that all boats would be lifted, and that has not clearly been the case. Huge numbers of communities and people have been devastated in recent decades, and in the U.S. and it's in the U.S. obviously Donald Trump is capitalizing off of the alienation felt by dispossessed white workers, people who are and many people who are probably not as poorly off as white working class people, but who feel downwardly mobile or who feel like society is falling apart in some way or in many ways, and like Donald Trump's simplistic explanation as to why.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's just pivot for a moment and talk about what the potential future is here, because the plan was, at least from, I guess it depends on whose perspective and which plan you're talking about, but the vote itself came up because David Cameron, in an attempt to onboard more, I guess, conservative elements of his party, promised this vote. And I guess sort of parallel to that, Boris Johnson was seeing this as an opportunity to ascend to the leadership of the Conservative Party. None of it seemed to work out the way these guys were planning, right? and what's stunning to me is that, so here's David Cameron, who had promised that if he lost, if Great Britain was to exit the EU, he would not resign, and he would immediately institute Article 50, which is and because there's no constitution in Great Britain, and because this referendum was non-binding, it would be basically just incumbent upon the ruling party to initiate the process of formally asking the EU for them to leave, and that would then initiate a 2-year process. Well, none of that's happening right now. And it seems like the only people who are really itching to get Great Britain out of the EU at this moment are the Germans, because they want to control. Where does this go now?
It is a situation that would be pretty hilarious if it wasn't so very consequential. In Boris Johnson's case, it's sort of like the proverbial dog running after the car, finally catching the car and having no clue what to do with it. And you saw that earlier this week as he made some statements about, I guess actually not that much is going to change about immigration or in a column, I think,
Right.
Into the UK, which then infuriated the more hard right Eurosceptics or anti-EU forces. And I think, as far as I can see today from what I've read, precipitated his decision to not put himself forward for prime minister. And then, I mean, David Cameron is just going to go down as one of the stupidest, most short-sighted politicians in the history of the world, probably. He pledged this referendum for his own political self-interest to maintain his hold on power. Never wanting to leave the EU, and because of that selfishness and short-sightedness, he got the exact opposite outcome of what he wanted. His short-term interests were to stay in power, but now, in terms of his long-term legacy, he's a total joke.
Right. I think what the kids would say is fail. What my 10-year-old daughter would say in regards to that.
Time.
Well, I mean, this is an ongoing story, of course, and we will continue our coverage of it. Daniel, thank you so much for your time today to just sort of outline these different dynamics. And I guess it remains to be seen how we address these questions in this country. Daniel Denvir, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.